I had wanted this for as long as I could remember. Every fleeting thought, every stolen glance had led me to this moment. That faithful day, everything aligned, and I finally had it, everything I'd ever truly desired. What happened next was mine alone, a secret adventure no one could ever trace, no one could ever know. Join me as I reveal the hidden journey of passion, daring, and freedom that changed everything. I didn't wake up that morning expecting my life to tilt. It was an ordinary day by every measurable standard. Same ceiling fan humming above me, same pale light slipping through the curtains, same routine pressing gently against my ribs. But something inside me had already shifted, quietly, patiently, as if it had been waiting for permission I didn't know I'd given. I had wanted many things in my life. Some loudly, some foolishly, some only when I was drunk enough to admit them to myself. But this was different. This wasn't a craving that burned hot and vanished. It was a want that had learned my name, memorized my habits, and settled into me like it had always belonged there. I didn't know yet that this would be the day everything aligned. Looking back, the signs were there long before that faithful day. They always are. We just pretend not to see them because acknowledging them would mean admitting we are capable of wanting what we are not supposed to touch. I met her in the most unremarkable way possible. No dramatic collision, no cinematic spark, just proximity, repetition, and silence stretched thin enough to become intimate. She existed in the same orbit as I did for a long time before either of us dared acknowledge the gravity. She was married. That fact sat between us like an unspoken rule, heavy and immovable. I respected it, or at least I told myself I did. Her husband was a presence without a face to me at first, an idea more than a man. And maybe that made it easier to pretend my interest was harmless. But interest doesn't stay harmless when it's fed. We talked, at first, about nothing. Safe things, surface-level exchanges that felt innocent because they were brief. Yet even then, I noticed how she listened. Not just with her ears, but with her body, leaning slightly forward, eyes steady, as if every word mattered more than it should. She had mastered restraint. I saw it in the way she smiled without fully committing to it, the way she paused before speaking, the way her hands stayed folded when they could have moved. That kind of control doesn't come from contentment. It comes from years of practice. And God help me, I recognized it because I carried the same discipline. I told myself it was admiration, respect, curiosity, anything but desire. But desire has a way of revealing itself in the quiet moments, when you find yourself replaying a conversation for no reason, or wondering what someone's silence means when they're not around. I wanted to know what lived beneath her calm. Weeks passed, then months. Our conversations grew longer, deeper, heavier. We spoke about disappointment without naming it, about responsibility without praising it, about the strange loneliness that can exist even when your life looks complete from the outside. She never spoke ill of her husband. That mattered to me more than I admitted. Instead, she spoke of absence. Emotional absence. The kind that doesn't leave bruises but slowly erases you. I feel invisible, she said once, not looking at me when she did. Those words lodged themselves somewhere deep in my chest. I didn't touch her. I didn't even think I wanted to. Not yet. What I wanted was more dangerous. I wanted to be the place where she was seen. Fully, honestly, without obligation. That faithful day didn't announce itself with thunder or urgency. It arrived quietly, like a door left unlocked. We were alone, not by design but by circumstance. The air felt different, thicker, slower. Conversation stalled, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. She sat across from me, close enough that I could notice the small details, the tension in her shoulders, the way she inhaled before speaking and exhaled without finishing the thought. Her eyes held something unsettled, something restless. I've never said this out loud, she began, then stopped. I didn't rush her. I had learned that patience was my sharpest weapon. I don't know who I am anymore, she said finally. Not outside of what's expected of me. That was the moment. Not the first touch. Not the first kiss. That sentence. Because in that confession, I heard the echo of my own buried truth. I had lived responsibly, carefully, respectably, and yet, somewhere along the way, I had stopped choosing things because I wanted them. I wanted this. I didn't step closer. I didn't lower my voice. I simply met her gaze and said, "You're allowed to want more than survival." Her breath caught, just slightly, but I saw it. The silence that followed was electric, heavy with possibility. We were standing on the edge of something irreversible, and we both knew it. She didn't reach for me. Instead, she asked the question that changed everything. What if I don't stop myself this time? There was no triumph in my answer. No arrogance. Only truth. Then you won't be alone. That was all it took. Not a kiss. Not a promise. Just permission. To want, to feel, to step beyond the narrow lines we'd been coloring inside for years. That day didn't end with scandal. No one burst in. No phone rang with accusations. The world didn't collapse. What happened instead was far more dangerous. She chose. And in that choice, I realized something that would follow me long after. Sometimes the most faithful act is finally being honest about what you desire, even if you never let the world see it. That was the day I got what I had truly wanted. Not her body, not her defiance, but the moment she stopped pretending her hunger didn't exist. And once that door opened, there was no going back. Desire doesn't arrive screaming. It arrives polite, almost respectful, asking only to sit beside you for a while. That's how it was with us after that day, quiet, measured, deceptively controlled. Nothing happened, and yet everything had already begun. We didn't speak about what had been said. Not directly. No declarations. No dramatic acknowledgements. But something fundamental had shifted, and we both felt it in the careful way we chose our words afterward. She became more deliberate. So did I. There is a particular kind of tension that exists only when two people know exactly what they are refusing to do. It sharpens the air. Every glance becomes weighted. Every pause stretches longer than necessary. We were practicing restraint not because we lacked courage, but because we had too much of it. I watched her more closely now. Not in a predatory way, but with awareness sharpened by intention. The way she exhaled when she laughed softly, as if laughter itself cost her something. The way her eyes lingered on me just a second longer than politeness allowed, then pulled away, disciplined, controlled. She was learning how to want without reaching. And I was learning how to wait without weakening. It surprised me how much pleasure there was in that waiting. Not frustration, control. Knowing I could take a step closer and choosing not to. Knowing that if my hand moved even an inch, the line would blur beyond repair. I respected her marriage more now than I ever had before. Not because it bound her, but because it framed the magnitude of what she was risking by even wanting. She spoke once about her husband again, briefly, carefully. "He doesn't see me struggle," she said. "Not because he's cruel, because he's busy being certain." That sentence stayed with me. Certainty can be a prison when you're locked inside someone else's confidence. I didn't offer solutions. I didn't criticize. I listened. And in listening, I gave her something she hadn't been asking for out loud: space. Our conversations grew heavier, more honest. We talked about youth lost quietly, about paths chosen too early, about how responsibility can become a mask you forget to remove. There was no flirting in the traditional sense. No playful innuendo. What passed between us was far more intimate than that. Truth. And truth, when shared with the wrong, or right, person, becomes dangerous. One evening, she asked me something that stopped me cold. "Do you ever think about who you'd be if you hadn't behaved so well?" The question wasn't playful. It was surgical. "Yes," I answered, "more often than I admit." She nodded, like she'd expected nothing less. That was when I realized, this wasn't about rebellion for her. It wasn't about escaping her life. It was about reclaiming a part of herself that had been slowly silenced by routine and expectation. And I wasn't trying to rescue her. I was standing beside her while she remembered herself. That distinction mattered. The first time we almost crossed the line, it was accidental. Or at least, we told ourselves it was. She stood too close. I turned too quickly. The space between us collapsed without warning. I could feel her breath, steady but shallow. The air shifted. My instincts screamed for movement. Neither of us moved. Time slowed in that suspended moment. I could have leaned forward. She could have stepped back. Either choice would have shattered the fragile balance we were holding. Instead, she whispered, "This is harder than I thought." I didn't pretend not to understand. "Yes," I said, "that's how you know it matters." She stepped away then, cleanly, deliberately, no apology, no embarrassment, just control reasserted. That night, I lay awake longer than I should have, replaying that moment, not with hunger, but with respect. Desire that respects boundaries becomes sharper, more focused. It doesn't dull with time, it deepens. I knew then that when, if, this ever moved beyond restraint, it wouldn't be reckless. It would be chosen with frightening clarity. She began to tell me about her adventures, though not in the way people expect when they hear that word. They were internal at first. Emotional risks, moments of honesty she'd denied herself for years. Small acts of rebellion that no one noticed but her. Saying no when she wanted to say no. Saying yes when she usually complied. Claiming silence when explanation was demanded. And through it all, she remained unseen by her husband, not because she was hiding, but because he had never learned how to look. That anonymity was her shield. And perhaps, her freedom. I understood then, she wasn't avoiding being caught. She was avoiding being defined. And I wasn't her accomplice. I was her witness. What we were building was quiet, invisible to the world, and therefore powerful. The danger wasn't discovery. The danger was how deeply this connection was rooting itself into places neither of us had planned to expose. Because desire, once acknowledged and respected, doesn't fade. It waits. And it waits with intention. There comes a point when restraint stops feeling like virtue and starts feeling like intention. I noticed the shift not because things grew louder, but because they grew clearer. Wanting her was no longer an ache I tried to quiet, it became something I carried with purpose. She changed, subtly at first. Not in the way she dressed or spoke, but in how she occupied space. There was less apology in her posture. Less explanation in her silences. She no longer flinched at her own honesty. And she stopped pretending this connection was accidental. One afternoon, she said, "I think about you more than I should." There was no tremor in her voice. No guilt, just acknowledgement. I answered her carefully, "Do you think about me because I'm forbidden, or because I'm honest with you?" She considered that, longer than expected. Then, "Because you don't ask me to be smaller." That admission landed heavier than any confession of desire ever could. From that moment on, everything we didn't do became deliberate. We chose distance when closeness would have been easier. We chose silence when words threatened to unravel us. The tension didn't fade, it matured. Sometimes we would sit across from each other, close enough to feel the warmth we pretended not to notice. Our conversations slowed, deepened. We spoke about regret not as something to avoid, but as something to understand. "I'm not running from my life," she said once. "I'm running toward myself." I believed her. Her husband remained a shadow at the edges of her world, present, dependable, unaware. She wasn't hiding bruises or lies. She was hiding awakening, and awakening is invisible to those who assume they already know you. That anonymity protected her. It also sharpened the risk. There were nights when I walked away from her and felt the weight of it in my chest, not frustration, but resolve. Because touching her would have been easy. Waiting required strength. I began to understand that what she wanted wasn't escape. It was permission, and she wasn't asking me to give it to her, she was asking me to stand steady while she took it herself. The closest we came to crossing the line happened quietly. She stood beside me, her arm brushing mine. The contact was light, accidental by anyone else's measure. But I felt it travel through me like a held breath released too quickly. She didn't pull away, neither did I. She turned her head slightly and said, almost to herself, "I trust you." That was the most dangerous thing she could have said. I stepped back, not because I didn't want her, but because I wanted this to remain hers. Her choice, her timing, her truth. Later, alone, I realized something that unsettled me more than desire ever had. I wasn't afraid of being discovered. I was afraid of being chosen. Because once chosen, restraint becomes irrelevant. And what replaces it must be handled with care, or it destroys everything it touches. She was still anonymous, still uncaught, still moving through her life with quiet precision. But inside, she was changing, and I was the only one who saw it happening in real time. That was the power of it. That was the danger. And that was the moment I knew, this was no longer about whether we could cross the line. It was about whether we were ready for what would happen when we did. The moment didn't arrive the way temptation usually does. There was no rush of blood, no reckless surge forward. It arrived calmly, almost respectfully, as if it had been waiting for us to be ready enough not to ruin it. By then, we had stopped pretending this connection was fragile. It wasn't. It was deliberate, structured, stronger than impulse. What made it dangerous wasn't heat, it was clarity. She chose the day. I remember that because she told me, plainly, without drama. I've decided, she said. Not what she'd decided, just that she had. And the weight of that statement settled between us like a held breath. I didn't ask questions. Questions would have implied doubt. Instead, I listened. I won't be careless, she continued. I won't be cruel, and I won't be owned by guilt that doesn't belong to me. That was when I understood, this wasn't about secrecy anymore. It was about authorship. She was taking control of her own narrative, and I was no longer just the witness. I was part of the story. When we finally closed the distance between us, it wasn't hurried. It was almost ceremonial, a quiet acknowledgement of everything we had chosen not to do until that point. Our closeness didn't explode, it settled. There is an intimacy that exists before touch ever does. A shared stillness, a recognition. When our foreheads rested briefly together, it felt like punctuation rather than climax. This is where we begin. She remained anonymous not because she feared discovery, but because anonymity was power. It allowed her to explore without explanation, to return to her life without suspicion, to carry this experience as hers alone. Her husband never caught her because there was nothing visible to catch. No frantic behavior, no sudden changes that screamed guilt. She moved with intention, not recklessness. That was her discipline. What we shared unfolded slowly, carefully, with reverence rather than hunger. It wasn't about being seen, it was about being understood. Every step forward felt earned, measured against the weight of consequence. I never mistook myself for her escape. I wasn't rescuing her from a life she hated. I was standing beside a woman who was finally claiming parts of herself she had postponed for too long. That distinction mattered more than anything. Afterward, after the closeness, after the quiet, we didn't linger in fantasy. We talked about boundaries, about endings, about how this would not become something sloppy or desperate. This doesn't own me, she said. It strengthens me, and she was right. Her adventures didn't look like chaos. They looked like confidence, like presence, like a woman who knew exactly where she stood, even when no one else knew what she carried. She returned to her life unchanged on the surface. Same routines, same expectations met, no alarms triggered, no suspicions raised, but inside, she was awake. And I knew, this was never about secrecy for secrecy's sake. It was about protecting something sacred from being flattened by judgment or misunderstanding. We didn't promise forever, we promised awareness. Fulfillment doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles into you so quietly that you don't realize it's there until you stop bracing for disappointment. That was how it felt in the weeks that followed, not triumphant, not reckless, not consumed by guilt. Just steady, grounded, as if something that had been misaligned for years had finally slid into its proper place. She didn't unravel after choosing herself. That was the part most people get wrong. They expect collapse, carelessness, panic, visible cracks. But she became sharper, more present, more herself, and because of that, no one suspected a thing. Her husband didn't catch her because there was nothing erratic to catch. No sudden absences, no nervous lies, no shift that screamed secrecy. She wasn't sneaking, she was integrating. What she carried with her didn't compete with her life, it completed something within it. That anonymity wasn't a weakness. It was strategy. What we shared never tried to spill into places it didn't belong. There were no impulsive demands. No jealous claims. No fantasies of replacement or escape. We met where we agreed to meet, emotionally present, mentally awake, and fully accountable for our choices. That was the real maturity of it. I never asked her for more than she chose to give, and she never offered more than she could carry without breaking herself. Desire, when respected, becomes sustainable. It stops being a fire and turns into warmth. One evening, she said something that still stays with me. I don't feel divided anymore. That mattered more than love declarations ever could. She wasn't living a double life, she was living a truer one. The version of herself she brought to me strengthened the version she carried everywhere else. That's why she remained unseen. People only notice secrets when they weaken you. This one didn't. There were moments, of course, when the weight of awareness pressed in. Not guilt, clarity, the understanding that fulfillment carries responsibility. That wanting something deeply doesn't excuse you from honoring boundaries. And we honored them. Endings were discussed without fear. Distance was respected without resentment. When silence was needed, it was taken without punishment. That discipline, the same discipline that kept her anonymous, kept this from turning into something careless. I never needed to be her center. I was part of her expansion. And that distinction protected us both. In quieter moments, alone, I reflected on the truth that had taken me years to admit. What I had truly wanted wasn't possession or conquest or even intimacy in the traditional sense. I wanted recognition, to be seen without expectation, to be chosen without obligation, to be part of a decision made consciously, not out of desperation or rebellion. That faithful day gave me that. And it gave her something just as powerful, the knowledge that her desires were not dangerous, shameful, or wrong. They were simply hers. She never lost herself to this. She never exposed herself to ruin. She never became a cautionary tale. She became awake, and I remained anonymous not because I feared the truth, but because some truths don't need an audience to be real. This wasn't a story about being caught. It was a story about being honest, quietly, deliberately, and without apology. That was what I truly wanted. And fortunately, I got it. This is a fictional story intended for a mature audience. All characters are anonymous, and any resemblance to real individuals is purely coincidental. The story explores adult emotions, desire, and personal choices and is not meant to encourage or endorse real-life actions. Reader discretion is advised. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction for mature audiences. All events and characters are imagined, any resemblance to real life is purely coincidental.